Hi, everybody. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about rubrics. What are some best practices, some different types of rubrics, advice for building your own rubrics. You'll be building a rubric or choosing a rubric that already exists in your course to share and discuss and analyze later in your assignment. So just keep an eye out for things that you might want to think about when you're looking at your own rubrics or creating new ones.
So we're going to look at some examples of types of rubrics so that you can see kind of what they might look like. None of these types are going to be wrong, but they're of varied levels of detail and are kind of appropriate for different types of assignments and different types of teaching styles. So just want you to be aware of what's available. So the first example that we're going to give you is a holistic rubric. So a holistic rubric just has sort of the levels of performance. In the example here, it's just sort of a 5-point scale so they can see if it's excellent, very good, good, limited, or poor. Sometimes people will just make it like the letter grades, A, B, C, D. You can make it a range of points if you know that, to get between a 90 and 100, you have to get this. To get between an 80 and an 89, you have to get this. The goal in a holistic rubric is to describe what does that level of paper look like. So instead of breaking it out into criteria like we'll look at next in analytic, it allows you to kind of list, hey, an A paper is going to look like this. A B paper is going to look like this. Not a whole lot of specific detail in this kind of rubric, so it does provide guidance, but maybe not enough specific guidance in terms of what you're looking for in the assignment. So keep that in mind as you consider using a holistic rubric.
So this rubric is probably the one that is most familiar to you, and that is the analytic rubric. It's also the one that provides the most amount of detail. As you can see along the top, we've got the levels of performance or levels of achievement, however you want to call those levels. In this case, they're described as beginning, developing, accomplished, exemplary. Sometimes you see things like poor, satisfactory, excellent, or just the point values. This is 5 points, 10 points, 15 points. The number of those varies as well. 3 to 5 is generally what we see. Then the criteria are listed along the left, and those are the different things you're looking for within the assignment in terms of, are you valuing the content or the timeliness or things like that for posts. And then students can see where they fall in terms of, for that criteria, I match the description under accomplished, or I match the description under exemplary. This also provides the most amount of transparency for grading and makes grading the most efficient because you can just fly through and say, okay, check, 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 check. All right, that means they've got a blank out of 20 or whatever the score is. That's the easiest way to be able to get through them quickly. So this is the preferred one generally, but it's one option.
So this example is not really a rubric, but we're including it because a lot of people would consider something like this a rubric. In fact, you see in the title, the person who wrote this wrote that it was the geology research paper rubric. What it does is essentially identify the criteria, but not describe the levels of performance. So it's showing that, having a cover page or having 4 pages written or having references are each worth a certain amount of points. And then on the right side, the instructor can fill out how many points they earned within that criteria. When it's something, that top part, for example, all those format items, I think that a checklist is very appropriate. Those are kind of very straightforward things. There's not a lot of messy interpretation. If you have a cover page, you get a point. If you don't have a cover page, you don't get a point. If you don't have that information at the top, you get 2. If you have all these different things that are kind of a yes, no, easily measured. But then when you look at organization/content, that's when this rubric doesn't really work as well. So introduction, body content, and conclusion summary. What gets you a 12 out of 12 for your content? There's nothing in there that's talking about, that I should be using examples or that I should be using references and outside research. So there's references up in the upper part, so it's implied, but there's not a lot of detail in terms of what makes a 12 out of 12 versus an 8 out of 12 in that category. So keep that in mind when you consider using this sort of checklist form of assessment. Again, not exactly a rubric because it's only criteria, not levels of performance.
So we're going to call this type of rubric a simplified analytic rubric because it does have both the criteria and the levels, but the levels are very simplified. In a way, this is a cross between an analytic rubric and that checklist option that we looked at. So as you see, the different criteria are listed on the left. But then on the right, the levels are just no, somewhat, and yes, right? And then people can just check which one. It looks like you've got the points assigned to 1 and 0, but those individual boxes aren't described. So when it's yes, no, and somewhat, that's a little bit easier. But if you were to say, full, partial, or none, or poor, satisfactory, excellent, or however you want to put those, you need to make sure it's something that's clear. So yes or no, I can measure that. How do I measure what is poor or satisfactory or excellent or good? That's when you definitely need to keep those descriptions in there. But if it's yes or no, then this is a pretty good option to be able to do something very quickly. Again, it's all about choosing the rubric that fits your needs for what you're trying to do. But if you're trying to make those levels something that is not a clear-cut yes, no, then this is not going to be a good one because you're not providing students any guidance as to what qualifies as that level for each criteria.
So we've seen a lot of examples now of different kinds of rubrics, and through those examples, you can see where the benefits are. That makes your expectations really clear. It's a good addition to any written instructions you have about an assignment because students can look to there to be reminded of what exactly you're looking for. It also makes grading a lot more efficient. So as you saw in a couple of the notes that we talked about, you can easily choose, hey, this gets this level in this criteria and this level in this criteria, or this just hits holistically this level. It allows you to very quickly identify how many points it should be as opposed to reading an entire piece or whatever and making a slightly more subjective judgment and trying to balance what your priorities are. I also really think it's good for detailed feedback. So there's a limit on how much feedback you're going to write on every assignment, especially when you have several assignments, many assignments to grade. By doing a rubric, by default, you're giving however many comments there are in those levels of criteria. So if my rubric has 5 criteria and I'm choosing a level for each criteria, then technically that's a little comment that I'm making for each one. So students can clearly see, what my feedback is in each of those areas. It also makes it easy to do a shorthand. So instead of me writing out, I wish you had developed more sources, or some of your sources don't seem adequate, you could go to the section on the rubric where it talks about your sources and make a quick comment either within that box, or if you're using Canvas, there's a way to do a comment within the within that criteria level, within that criteria row, so that way they kind of already have the context. You can do a quick abbreviation based on what's already written there. And I think the last thing that we didn't really put in here, but it kind of goes with clear expectations and feedback. There's more transparency. Students don't feel like it is guesswork. If students feel like whether they get an A or a B is really fuzzy, well, they're less motivated to really strive for that A because it doesn't matter. She's just going to give me whatever she gives me. But if they can see clearly what those levels are that you're looking for, they not only do they have a better idea of how to meet those levels, but they also have the sort of connotation, the belief that you are grading fairly across all students, that they're not worried about any kind of bias you may have or any kind of subjective opinions you might have. So a lot of students really respect being able to have that transparency in the assessment process. So keep that in mind.